please remember that when things get rough, you can always leave over there and come here to Sankofa Books and sit down and relax. Because this is the liberation space and the liberation zone.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Good, okay. My name is Ben Woods, or Benjamin Woods. I'm one of the coordinators of this program event here at the Sankofa Bookstore. The title of this event, this is a part of a series called The Black Left in the 21st Century. We had an event last month called Which Way Forward, Race, Class, or Both, and it was a debate discussing the issue of race first or class struggle or both, or some sort of kind of synthesis of the two. And it was a very good debate, had a very good turnout. And so this is the second out of 4 different series of forums and discussions we're going to be having. Today, the title of the event is Africans at Home and Abroad, Black Internationalism in the 21st. And I do want to stop and actually acknowledge that today is actually someone who was a Black internationalist, W.E.B. Du Bois. It's his birthday today, and he's one of the major figures that actually I'm sure a couple of the people I know are actually going to be talking about, so I'm not going to go actually too in depth with him. So they're going to talk about him somewhat. But the topic for today is going to discuss the topic of Black internationalism and its relevance. And what I mean by Black internationalism is connecting and linking the struggles of Black people in the United States to other struggles, other Black peoples, other oppressed people. And it's something that Black people have been doing since for generations, going back to at least slavery. People would go to Europe and other places and try to build solidarity around the issues of slavery and segregation, colonialism. And what we're going to talk about is the history of that and how that is even current today. Because before globalization, the term that's been thrown around, Black people had been doing a lot of internationalism in their organizing and activism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce, we have 4 panelists with us today to discuss this. We're going to have a short period where they're going to give a short presentation, kind of in their specific areas. We'll have a kind of, after that, a short time where it'll be discussion between each of the panelists, and then a question and answer session, probably at least minimum 30 minutes with the audience, or comments and questions. Okay, so first we have on my left is James Pope. James Pope received his PhD in 2012, focusing on Black politics, international relations, comparative politics. In addition to cultivating a research agenda that endeavors to map the traditions and continuities of Africana thought and behavior as it relates to human rights, he has taught courses on African and African American politics in history at Howard and Georgetown universities. Currently, James teaches in the Department of African American Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. He is a senior research fellow with Trans Africa and was a human rights education facilitator with Amnesty International in Washington, D.C., and he is also an executive producer of Africa Now at WPFW. And next to him is Yejide Arun Mila. She has been a leading member in the Uhuru movement since 2010, formerly the chair of the DC branch of the African People's Socialist Party. She now works in the Department of Agitation and Propaganda for the party, as well as the social media coordinator. She also serves as the Director of Information and Education for the All African People's Development and Empowerment Project, which is the development arm of the African People's Socialist Party. Next to her left, is Alhaji Conte. He is a PhD student in the Department of History at Howard University. He holds a master's degree in African American Studies from Temple University. He is originally from San Jose, California. And last but not least is Arba Evelyn Johnston Arthur. She is an activist, cultural, community, and theory worker, lecturer and co-founder of Pumoja, Movement of the Young African Diaspora in Austria, and the research group of Black Austria History as well. And present's currently working on her dissertation on the historical actuality of institutional racism on resistance in the African diaspora in Austria, and she's at the Howard University Department of Political Science. So if you can welcome all of our panelists. And so we're going to begin with each of the panelists going to give a short presentation, and we're going to start with Alhaji.
All right, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Let me first start off by thanking Ben and Sankofa for having us. And what I'd like to do today is discuss my dissertation, which deals with Black internationalism. But before I get into that, I'd like to kind of explain what brought me to Black internationalism and history. The reason why I became a historian is because I believe that the lessons that we learn from studying our history will help us and inform us on how we should move forward in our liberation struggle. So there's a couple of things that in my recent studies that I've learned, lessons learned from the Council on African Affairs, group that I'll go into a little bit further in a couple of minutes. But there's three basic things that I think most Black internationalists have done, and I think would be very easy for us as individuals and as collectively to apply to today's struggle. First and foremost, I think it's very important as internationalists that we educate ourselves about international politics. Obviously, before you can take any action, you have to know what's going on internationally. So that's one of the first things I would suggest. Secondly, I think we have to be very aware and very critical of U.S. foreign policy, specifically as it relates to African people globally, right? And then third, I think we should create international networks of solidarity. And again, this is something that internationalists of the past have done, and I believe that we need to continue to do as well today. All right, so again, I mentioned briefly that I'm a PhD student and I'm studying a group called the Council on African Affairs. This group was around in the 1930s, from 1937 until 1955, and their main objective was to educate American people about anti-colonial struggles in Africa, right? They also wanted to influence U.S. foreign policy as it pertained to Africa, and they created solidarity networks with African nationalist groups in the 1940s and 50s. And I want to begin with a quote from Alpheus Hutton, who was the educational director of the group. And in 1946, he received a letter from an African American asking why they spend so much time focusing on Africa when there was so many issues that African Americans were facing here in the United States. And this was his answer. If you say that what goes on in the United States is one thing quite different from what goes on in the West Indies, Africa, or anywhere else, then you are quite wrong. Jim Crowism, colonialism, and imperialism are not separate enemies, but a single enemy with different faces and different forms. So I would say generally that kind of describes an internationalist perspective. In this case, again, particularly Black internationalism. So from my studies and from my understanding, internationalism really doesn't have a very concrete definition per se. I know me and Ben and my other colleagues discussed this a lot. In the historical literature, though, a lot of times you see that the term Black internationalist is applied solely to people who were part of the Communist International during the 1920s and 30s. But as Ben kind of mentioned in his introduction, and as I'll expand upon in a minute, internationalism is something that African people have been using as a tool for our liberation for a very long time. In fact, internationalism is not always necessarily radical in nature, although it does usually at least attempt to unite the struggles for human rights, but it's not necessarily always radical. There's people like Bayard Rustin and Walter White who are internationalists but weren't necessarily considered radical. One of the best, or one of the working definitions that I use to define internationalism, Black internationalism in particular, comes from a book called From Toussaint to Tupac by West, Martin, and Wilkins. And they define Black internationalism by saying that at the core of Black internationalism is the ideal of universal emancipation unbound by national, imperial, continental, oceanic boundaries, or even racial ones. So therefore, a lot of these internationalists, again, Black internationalists first and foremost were concerned with African people worldwide and our struggle for liberation. But they, in many cases, built networks, solidarity networks with Indian organizers on the continent of Africa and South Africa, also in India, and Asians and Latinos worldwide, right? Because they understood that the oppression that these colonized people were facing was very similar to the oppression that African people face. All right, so who are some internationalists? Of course, we always mention W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, but the Black Panther Party, of course, were internationalists. We can go back to Toussaint Dessalines, Garvey, Claudia Jones, Paul and Islanda Robeson. All of these people built international networks to try and further the Black liberation struggle. All right, so let me go into the Council of African Affairs a little bit more. One of the reasons why I decided to study this group is because I felt like the 1930s and 40s is greatly overlooked. I know in my African American history classes in undergrad, we went from the 1920s and 30s talking about the New Negro and Harlem Renaissance movement, and then we kind of skipped to the 1950s, the beginning of the Civil Rights movement. But there was a lot of things that were going on in the 1930s and 40s, and the Council on African Affairs was involved in a lot of it. Again, as I mentioned, their primary goal was to educate the American public about anti-colonial struggles in Africa, whether it was violent repression of Africans in South Africa, whether it was mine workers or the ANC, or whether it was in Nigeria when newsletters, Nnamdi Azikiwe's newsletter was banned because it was subversive. Right? They not only did they inform the American public about these issues, they attempted to get Americans to petition, to send money to these people if they needed money for legal cases. And again, they built that solidarity network. They also attempted to influence U.S. foreign policy towards Africa, and this was at a very important time because it was at the founding of the UN. So they were very instrumental in the founding of the UN and attempting to make sure that the UN was held accountable for African people. And again, as I mentioned, they provided support to African liberation struggles, African nationalist movements. They were directly connected with the African National Congress in South Africa, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and others. So again, I think I'm gonna stop here. But again, I think a lot of the lessons that I've learned from them we can apply to today, and I guess we'll get into that a little bit more briefly.
All right, thanks. And the next panelist is Yejide Arun Mila. Hand it to her.
Can everyone hear me? Okay? Okay. So, thank you again, Ben, for inviting us to be a part of the panel. I'm always a little nervous when I make these presentations, but I hope I'm okay. And so I am a part of, as Ben said, I'm a part of a political African organization called the African People's Socialist Party. I'll just move up a little bit. The African People's Socialist Party, and I've been in that organization for a long time. And so the theory of the party, the political theory of the party, is African internationalism. And so this is what informs the way that we move through the world. This informs the way that we develop and strategize and struggle against the oppression of African people. And so, you know, I'm gonna talk a little bit about that as I do my presentation. But I do want to say that a precursor to the African People's Socialist Party in terms of its internationalist perspective is Marcus Garvey, who was the first African to build an international network of Africans anywhere on the face of the planet, and had one of the largest organizations with millions of Africans from Africa to the Caribbean to the United States, and we hold high our Marcus Garvey for doing that. And so I'm just going to read from my little notepad, and I'll stop at certain points and come back through. But African internationalism is the political theory of the African People's Socialist Party. It's a theory developed by our chairman, Omali Eshatella. It's a theory that places Africa and African people at the center of world history, whereas before we were kind of like the side note of history. We see how the rise of capitalism and its highest manifestation, imperialism, needed as a precondition the enslavement, colonization, and oppression of African people in order to survive. Our centrality to this whole thing helps us to understand that it will be a revolution under the leadership of the African working class that will ultimately bring about the collapse of the worldwide capitalist system and usher in a new period of a socialist development. And this won't happen in one particular place Instead, it has to be taken on from Africans from all over the world, especially in imperialist centers like here in the United States. We have to take it down from the inside out to help the struggles in other places carry out their agenda. And we're going to have to bring science into revolutionary struggle. So I'm going to go into a little bit of a history lesson here when we said, before capitalist colonialism, there was no Europe. Only a collection of feudal, mercantile, and tribal towns, states, and kingdoms that warred with one another. There was no France, there was no United Kingdom, no Germany. Europe was born when it was connected with and became dependent first on Africa, then America, and lastly Asia. When European nations clashed over territories in Africa, only then was there a reason for them to organize themselves so they wouldn't step on each other's toes. So they unified with the creation of African territories so that they can exploit for the development of their own countries. And that still happens today. Through this exploitation, they can build a wealthy European collective. This is what Marx described as primitive accumulation of capital, the theft of land and resources from oppressed people around the world. And after World War II, Europe emerged once again, being devastated. They started from nothing again, from having this internal war. And so through their relationship with African countries or the African colonies, they were able to build themselves up again. It was during this period of recovery that the United States came to the forefront of imperialism through the creation of the Marshall Plan, which essentially was the first country or region aid package. This plan was meant to reestablish and save capitalism and Europe as a Western capitalist front of imperialism. A weakened Germany had all of its colonies taken away and redistributed to other European nations. It was during this time that we see Africa emerging in the fight for liberation. After centuries of European domination, Africans recognized the weakness of the metropoles, and many Africans seized this opportunity to struggle for independence. So national liberation movements were born in places like Algeria, Guinea, Ghana, Libya, South Africa, Angola, Mozambique. But many of these struggles called for the freedom from European domination only. So when African countries were granted independence, many of these leaders couldn't see beyond that point to struggle for the end of imperialism, which was what was needed to stop it. So what happened is that imperialism had a chance to regroup. And so African leaders still could not see their relation to the rest of the world beyond the national question, and in some cases flirted with the U.S. in an attempt to get international support as they tried to shift their economies from one that was dependent upon the European economy to one that was now going to be in some sort of a relationship with the United States. But we all know how that turned out. And as revolutionary leadership was picked off one by one, the imperialists manipulated the political landscape through their own selection of African leadership, thereby installing leadership that would still do their bidding. This is what Nkrumah called neocolonialism, or black power in white power in blackface. We did, however, learn a lesson from the national liberation struggles, because now we knew that it was possible to struggle against foreign oppression. We saw how African states aligned with one another and brought us closer to having liberated regions on the continent. However, these African blocs did not last long because they were undermined by petty bourgeois class interest. We saw how in these cases, national liberation struggles gave way to more repressive petty bourgeois leadership governments. So African internationalism exposes the issue of class interests more seriously than other organizations, I think, and other movements. It's quite possible for there to be a petty bourgeois nationalist to exist. There are people who have bourgeois aspirations or aspirations to mimic white power, but the difference is that instead of having a black face, instead of having a white face, now is fronted by a black face. They aspire to be as powerful as the Fords or the Rockefellers, to own industry and build business at the expense of the African worker, and they will eventually betray any liberation movement that they are part of. It is only when petty bourgeois forces commit what Cabral called for, which is class suicide, and they align themselves with the African workers and peasants, and so that they can ensure that the I'm almost done. So that they can ensure that the struggle is actually going to go beyond self-interest. So we saw that this type of neocolonialism, switch happened with Uganda's Idi Amin, who was a petty bourgeois, radical black nationalist, who had a line like, I want all these white people out of my country, but yet committed some of the most atrocious acts against his own African people. The same bait and switch occurred here in the United States in 2008 with the selection of Barack Obama, which is the U.S.'s own brand of neocolonialism. And a lot of Africans fell for it. They expected that Obama would finally deliver the black justice this country sorely needed. But instead, as time went on, they found themselves making excuses for his inaction. Suddenly Africans would know backwards and forward the 3 levels of government, how everything works, why this government would not accept or allow Obama to do anything, whereas that excuse was never used for any of the previous presidents. Then it became a question of Democrat versus Republican, as if both parties were not aligned in the interest of in the survival of capitalism. So African internationalism allows for Africans to see past all these attempts to a future where we will be a free African nation and united under a united socialist Africa. And what African internationalism calls for is a reclamation of our resources so that we can live like upright men and women. This cannot happen through voting. We shouldn't wait until imperialism concedes defeat, because by then imperialism will be on another stage of redeveloping itself. So what needs to happen is that there needs to be a worldwide struggle led by the African working class in order to see imperialism eviscerated. And so the whole strategy of the party is to build fronts of the African liberation movement in different places. And currently we have members in the United States, in the Caribbean, and in Germany, and in Sweden, and in Canada, and we have everywhere, because we understand it's not going to happen just in one place. And an internationalist movement is more than just saying, yeah, we black like each other, but it's more about let's work together to kind of end the system that oppresses us everywhere in the world. So, yeah.
Thank you. And our next panelist is Arba Johnston-Arthur.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I if I don't have to. Hello, can everyone hear me? Kind of?
Yes.
No. All right. No? Is it okay now? Am I speaking loud enough?
Yeah, directly into it and loud.
All right.
There you go. Just like that.
All right. Okay. I want to thank Benjamin Woods for organizing this very event. And I also want to thank him for including me in this discussion. It means a lot to me to speak from a perspective of being somebody from the African diaspora in Austria. It's not really a place where you would expect black people to be. But at the same time, if it comes to black people presently, there's no place where there is no black people. Now, of course, the fact that nobody expects us to be there has a very important impact on the way we perceive ourselves. But I cannot start speaking without also relating the fact why I'm even here in the United States and sitting here to a reality that's also connected to Black internationalism. There's so many ways to look at it. And I want to also include a more personal level, and that's also the fact that Haile Gerima in his last film, Teza, included the experience of the African diaspora in Germany and connected it to the experience of the continent. And he thought it's an experience and it's a history that matters, it's a story that matters to be told within the very complex history of Ethiopia in the 70s. And this inclusion, this strong message that our experience matters to be told and there's connections, was and is something that is extremely powerful and empowering, and it's something that also goes to show that there is something like an internationalist understanding of our experiences. I was really, I can't even explain what it meant that our experience was understood in that way. So it's connected to me even coming to the United States, and I think it's a very important aspect. Now, Ben mentioned the dissertation that I'm writing on, and I am part of a black movement in Austria. And in the 90s, there was a very strong community, or like a community self-organization in the face of police brutality. There was a pattern of police brutality, black people being killed by the police. And in the 90s, just a few months after we basically organized ourselves, what happened was the biggest police raid in the Second Republic of Austria. It was called Operation Spring, and it basically criminalized our protest and constructed our network as part of an international drug ring. And the patterns in which this was done are very familiar, and it really looked like watching a film, because it seemed like something you would have seen happening to movements in the US, black movements in the US, who were much more radical than we were, because we just started to basically organize ourselves. So from that on, I wanted to write my dissertation on institutional racism and resistance. I had to come here because racism is still basically contested. It's contested to exist, right? It's hard to work with a professor that basically contests if racism still exists or not. Now, another aspect that I find very important, and people that spoke to me have before me have mentioned that, and also Haji, the aspect of history being so important. And something that I grappled with is also how the politics of history work in a way that we erase our own memory of our resistance and our own connections that we used to have. Because now it seems to be like a very extraordinary thing that there's black people in Germany or Austria, but there have been connections in the 30s. If you think of Patmore, he was in Germany in the 30s. So there have been connections that we kind of rediscover, but how does it happen that we erase our own connections? And it's something that we also experienced in the 90s because we felt that for the first time we go on the streets and we are post-thankful, we fight for our rights. But then talking to my father's generation, I found out about an activist, a Pan-African activist, who was the president of the Pan-African Union by the name of Onokama Okonjo from Nigeria, who was very outspoken against racism in the 60s. And she spoke about racism in Austria at a conference in Moscow, a conference of African students in Moscow. She talked about racism in the trade union in Austria. And she talked about racism in the student union in Austria, with the result of being deported from Austria. At the same time, if I look at the 60s, there was a level of Black internationalism and understanding of linking, as has been said already, of linking the struggle against racism with the struggle against imperialism that seems to have been lost in the present. Now, at the same time, of course, there is a great danger of romanticizing the 60s, me, being a child of the 70s. But at the same time, I think it's a very important work to remember the resistances that we had. Just an example about the present day, which I find, I was just talking to Haji, but I just find in general, like right now, if it comes to Black internationalism, from my perspective, I think we're in bad shape, like at least from my perspective, in the sense that I see much more fragmentation, much more only issue-related links. And to give you an example, there was a hearing on Friday in the EU Parliament. There's a network against racism, and people of African descent. There's a hearing on Afro Phobia in Europe, right? And it is a tendency also to use, there's the longing to address the specific oppression that people of African descent face, specifically as people of African descent. But at the same time, the notion of Afrophobia erases the structures of exploitation and just limits it to a psychological phobia. You're just afraid, but it's deconnecting racism from its structure. It's deconnecting the reality of racism being part of imperialism. And this is a notion that is reflected in the ways we organize ourselves. At the moment, there has been, like if I look at ways in which Black internationalism has been reflected in present movements within the European context, I think what is very important is, the refugee protest movement, and especially in France, the sans-papiers movement, meaning without papers, have been very strong in making those connections, in connecting realities of imperialism to realities of migration. The Fortress of Europe is a reality in which, like just last year on the 3rd of October, there was a ship that sank, and there were about 360 people, mostly from Eritrea and Somalia, some also from Ghana, who died. The militarization of the borders is a strong issue. But if we're not able to address our oppression from an internationalist perspective, then I think our position is very much weakened. So I would say self-critically that also our movement within the Austrian context has not always been able to make those connections. And I think it's one thing to be Black internationalist from a theoretical point of view, but for me too, coming here to the US, it has really forced me to deprovincialize, is that? Okay, so deprovincialize myself from going beyond the Austrian realities and defining activism beyond the village that I basically know, but at the same time realizing how the patterns of resistance are connected and the patterns of oppression are connected. Okay, thank you.
And our final panelist will be Dr. James Pope.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to have a really eloquent opening because I've had a very, very interesting weekend. I'm running from one talk to another talk, so I'm trying to switch my mind over into the different topics that we're doing. So one of the things that I wanted to do is, interestingly enough, is that what I spend most of my time doing is basically mapping and identifying the continuities of this thing called Black internationalism, but also looking at it within the context, or looking at it within the perspective of not in the historical perspective, but how can we use history as a weapon today? Meaning that how can we understand it within the context of moving movements and sustaining movements to be something that is realizable today in the 21st century. So interestingly enough, I guess that's why I'm here, being in the 21st century as far as Black internationalism. I've recently started to, not recently, I started back in my research. I've recently started to understand this idea of internationalism within the context of people of Africana descent, because I think it's important for us to reconceptualize these particular concepts of Black, African American, and Africana, to separate them, because to start from a place becomes very, very important. So one of the things that in all of the talks that we were given today is that I want us to make sure that we don't forget the crystallization of Black internationalism with the Haitian Revolution, because that was a very, very important point in the Black world, or in the Africana world, because it was a watershed moment that not only struck fear in the heart of those who were oppressed, but it also gave a sense of opportunity to those who were being oppressed. So I think that is important to understand there. So with that said, is that one of the things I've been doing is how do we understand internationalism? And understanding internationalism, we first have to understand, I think Alhaji talked about this in the first part, is that there's actually two strands of Black internationalism. There's a radical strand, and then there's individuals who were considered to be international, but they really just didn't do anything within the context of doing anything for people of African descent or the African continent. And the reason why that becomes important is because when we're starting to understand who is for liberation and who isn't, we have to have some type of measure. And within that particular context, I think it's important to understand that there's some points of continuity in this historical thing that we call Black internationalism, that actually what I've discovered is that internationalism is just a component of it. And what happens is that in all of the literature and all of the things that I'm finding is that the reason why it's pretty much hard to define is because it's built in the praxis of people of African descent in Africa, because it's a response to the evolutionary concept, an evolutionary construct of imperialism and colonialism. So it looks different in different places. So I think it's important to understand this, but even though it looks different in different places, how does it connect to the entire African world? So with that said, is that I think that there's some points that hopefully we'll get into the discussion a little bit later that we'll be able to point out, is that internationalism was one component of what we call a Black human rights consciousness, critical consciousness. And I'll explain that shortly. So once we look at the practices of individuals that were most left of the left, because Bernard Rustin was considered to be left, but as far as like really doing anything for the continent of Africa, African people, there's a lot left to be wanting there. If we look at the historical record there, but we look at this particular point is that there was internationalism, but also there was a clear effort in creating a counter discourse to imperialism, to colonialism, to racism, to capitalism. It was written and verbal. And the reason why I say it's written and verbal is because you have the Council of African Affairs, you have other institutions, including William Patterson, who gave a petition in 1952 to the UN that we charge genocide. So there's written document, but also the reason why it's important to understand there's verbal documents is because we have individuals such as Malcolm X, who did not leave a large cache of written materials, but a large amount of interviews and talks that we must be able to fit within the context of moving forward. So there also is a deeper understanding of human rights. Now this becomes important because this human rights question is a question that I deal with consistently, because human rights from the perspective of people of African descent in Africa is different than the idea of human rights that we hear from the UN and also these imperial and colonial reinscribed nations that we have today within the context of the Western world. So there was a different context which actually calls into question the actual praxis and conceptual foundations of human rights within itself. There was also a clear ideological frame of reference that guided liberation efforts. Now this becomes very, very essential. This is where Fanon and Cabral becomes important as far as within the context, because you have to have an ideological, something to point you into a direction. So if you're talking about freedom and you're talking about liberation, but yet you have no type of foundation, or you have no type of what Cabral says, no type of theory, and also that links back to other individuals in revolutionary types of thought or radical types of thought, you're going to be basically spinning your wheels in the sand. The next aspect that I think is important is a clear adherence to the importance of creating institutions that captures these three components that I just talked about. So when we're talking about internationalism, I even say that we even have to move beyond this idea of Black internationalism, because the reason why I say that, and I'll get into that, we need to move into an Africana internationalism, because Africana gives you context. Being Black within the context, the way that we understand it, it was a response. We understand the particular history of that, because we go from, we have this idea of moving from slave to Negro to colored to Black to African American. But then what happens is that we don't understand this African context, or the African elements that move people around the world. And so I'll stop there, because I think it's important for us to kind of engage in this dialogue and move into things. And hopefully I've said some things that you'd be like, man, what is he talking about?
Okay, so all right, thank you everyone for each of the panelists for each one of those presentations. Very good. So now we're going to have a short portion for at least maybe 20 minutes or so. We kind of have dialogue among the panelists around more current event topics that are in the news. Because one thing we want to discuss was having the historical component, which all of them get into. But what are the issues today as we saw Black left in the 21st century? What is the relevance today? So I'm going to ask a short question and then kind of get everyone's response from it, those who choose to answer if they can. So right now you have there's a far right-wing extremist groups in North America, such as the Tea Party, and you have the growth of like these neo-Nazis, right-wing militia groups in the US and in Europe. such as Golden Dawn in Europe, National Front, she mentioned France, in the Ukraine, in the news, but actually the centerpiece of that is these neo-Nazi groups that are actually the centerpiece of that. So with this explosion in the last few years that has happened to this, even though it's always been there, but in the last probably 10 years or so, you have this huge explosion in the numbers. What do you think are the factors that have led up to this? And any suggestions on what we can do? Because this is actually in North America and Europe especially. Anyone want to tackle that one?
Like I said, I tricked you guys. I said I wasn't going to talk, but I'm actually really going to talk more. But one of the things that Ben is alluding to, and specifically I think it's important to understand, is that one of the things that I think is one of the things I think is important to understand about this particular aspect is that when the missing piece and the allowance of these particular aspects of right wing to be developed is because you have a stifling of the black left. And the reason why I say that, or the fragmentation of the black left, and the reason why I say that is because when you look at the history of this particular idea of black left and what they were doing and what they were talking about, individuals such as W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, William Patterson, James Esther Jackson. Then you have in the George Patmore, you have all of these individuals, Amilcar Cabral, when we get to the 70s, is that a lot of these individuals understood the idea of racism in a global context. And what ended up happening is that it allowed racism within the context of in its geographical spaces to evolve. And so when you have this particular evolution in these particular spaces, then you're gonna have this backlash that happens with what happens when you have any type of progress. So I think what happened is that to answer that particular question, one side of that is the simple fact of is that you had individuals who were on a global stage, who were people of African and African descent, who were calling to question these particular contradictions in society. And so that idea of racism basically was able to incubate in its geographical location and isolation, and now we're having an explosion because of course there's a crisis in capitalism in a global context. So I think it's important to understand it in that particular context as well.
I wanted to add something, maybe like concerning Europe, and there's been a lot of reports about the rise of right-wing populist parties in Europe. And I think if it comes to Europe, it's also a very good way to mask the realities of racism. Because what happens in those discourses is that there's no racism, there's just the rise of the right wing, and everyone else is not, you know. But in what is connected with this so-called rise is a shifting to the right of the so-called left, right? So the left is, I mean, it can't really be called left anymore because it's so right. And you look at the parties, the Social Democrats, you can take Austria, you can take Germany, you can take so many examples. They have taken up positions that previously have been the positions of right-wing populists. So in various ways, it has enabled to also hide the structures of oppression and exploitation. In the case of Norway, for example, I was reading an article about Norway. I think you sent it to us after the terrorist attack of Breivik, saying that the Norwegian right wing has helped basically grow this individual monster. But what also happened is that there was a discovery of racism in Norway as if it's something new. The fact is that people of color have been subjected to racist terror before that as well. And it's just something that has been invisibilized. And in general, if it comes to Europe, and I think it can be connected to the States as well, there's never really been a dealing with Europe's colonial legacy that is still lived. And in the previous preamble of the European Union, the previous statement was conscious that Europe is a continent that has brought forward civilization. And this is a myth that is still re-inscribed. I mean, it's still a struggle that is continuing. In France, there was a big conflict on the so-called memory laws. I think it was 2006, where the government wanted to impose a positive image of colonialism in the school books, in the institution. There was a rising resistance against that, but it's just something that goes to show in various ways. So I think this talk about the rise of the far right really enables to cover the realities of this shifting of the, I don't know if I'm clear, but it's like basically everything is, and it's very integrated. It's very much in the middle of everything. So racism just becomes the issue of the far right, and it's not connected to the global realities of imperialism.
So what I think is, what I feel like I know is that it's just a case of chickens coming home to roost. And we have African population and other populations that have been oppressed by Europe and European countries for so long that a lot of them choose to leave their countries and go to United States, go to Europe, go these places. And so what we have now is, not now, but always been there, has been, you have large African other populations that are becoming larger in these areas. And so and then we have the fall of capitalism because it's dying, and imperialism is dying. And so what was once this grand Europe is a poor Europe, is a Europe that doesn't have enough money in certain cases in certain countries. They're the Europe that has to fight for its identity. Now they want to close their borders and be all to themselves, where previously they were out dominating the world. And so now we have these former colonial subjects, people that they bombed, history of murder and violence, and these people are living now in their countries. And so we have the emergence of this far right that is scared that these people are going to do something. And so now they have to build up this thing in their head where we got to protect what's ours. And so what they're doing is they're inciting. They're starting to incite this kind of nationalist perspective in Europe and the United States as well, about this is the land of the home and the free, and this is where, doing things like, saying colonialism was good and putting that in school books because they want to fool themselves into thinking that this was the reality. And it was the reality for many Europeans, but for the people that they dominated, it was not. And so this rise of these groups, and even the former left going to the right, as she said, is people who actually just was trying to straddle that liberal balance until they start to realize that this is going to affect us too. Let's go on over to this side as well. And so that's why I think it's it's really showing its head right now.
And I think as far as Europe goes, I think I agree with everybody on the panel, but I think the rise of these right-wing groups in the United States kind of provides us with an opportunity to strengthen our solidarity networks with Chicano and indigenous people in particular. If you look at Arizona and like the law, the SB 1070 law, that's very similar to stop and frisk, right? So it gives us an opportunity to strengthen those networks with Chicano and indigenous people, specifically in the Southwest, but also in Florida and New York as well, because again, the people in New York who are being stopped by the police are predominantly of African descent and Latino. So again, I think this rise of these fascist laws and these right-wing groups gives us an opportunity to build these networks. So that's basically what I'm saying.
Okay. All right. Now this is going to switch up, taking it more to Africa, just particularly talking about South Africa. She said, You're already ready. So, yeah, the African diaspora made several contributions to the liberation movement in South Africa, Zania, right? But many people today would argue that the ANC sold out. That's an argument that people in South Africa and people who fought for it now make in terms of what happened. What do you all think were the mistakes that were made during the anti-apartheid movement? And what are some of the ways we can show some solidarity? I mean, that's on our side and theirs. I'm not just talking about one side, but on the diaspora side, on South Africa, and then how do we show our solidarity or support?
So the ANC, I don't believe sold out. I think that they were already there. You know what I mean? Like they had an integrationist policy from the very beginning. You know what I mean? Like they just wanted to be like everyone else. You know, they wanted to, you know, get power and hobnob. And so that's why it's not a big surprise that when Nelson Mandela came out of prison, that he kind of like, you know, shook Leclerc's hand and just kept it moving, you know, like it was nothing. And many of the largest majority, the people are still living in these shanty towns and dilapidated housing and the conditions in the mines, and the workers aren't being paid enough, and the ANC is in power now, and they allow for this to happen. And so it's because that was the aspiration. That's where the interest of, that's where the topic of the topic of class comes in. You know who was populating this party? Was it the workers and the peasants, or was it these intellectuals, petty bourgeois people who wanted to just be like the white minority and just run the country? And that's all they wanted to do. They wanted to own the means of production. They wanted to get something out of the means of production, but in the meantime, they're still going to go ahead and oppress the African workers. And so right now, we saw last year actually where we had these massive strikes on South Africa. And right now for 4 weeks straight, there's the platinum miners are in strike. And then I just read something where they call them the platinum bosses, want to make strikes illegal. And so therefore, it gives them a reason to imprison these people who just want a living wage, and also to and do worse than that. As you saw, they didn't have any problems with killing black folk. And so, you know, I think that it's just how we can express solidarity is unite with the workers. I don't think we should unite with any political party that has proven themselves not to be a friend of the majority of the population. And unite with other organizations that do that as well.
Yeah, well, the strikes in particular are something that's interesting, because again, when I studied the Council on African Affairs, in 1946, there was a major strike in South Africa, and this is pre-apartheid South Africa, but of course, still very racist, very reactionary South Africa at the time. And they killed about, at minimum, 9 of the workers and wounded about 1,200 of them and forced them back into the mines. And the Council on African Affairs at the time was sending money and sending food and supplies to the group to try and assist them during the strike period. But then if you see in 2012, as we're all familiar with, there was another strike under the ANC as government where miners were killed, right? So obviously the issue that was taking place in South Africa is not just about race. Apartheid, quote unquote, is over, but there's still class issues that need to be dealt with. And one of the things that I kind of believe that the ANC did sell out is because in the Freedom Charter, it did say that they were going to nationalize these mines and that the wealth of the nation was going to be used for the people of the nation. So they said that in the Freedom Charter, but unfortunately they never lived up to it. So I do believe that they did kind of sell out. But it's very similar, I would say, to the United States situation, because you have a black leadership class who were black faces in high places, but again, they're not working for the interest of the vast majority of black people, either here or on the continent in South Africa.
Yeah, I think everything was there.
Yeah.
I wanted
You don't
to.
have a response to anything you all say. Go ahead.
I wanted to say quickly that the measure of progress is the condition of the masses, no matter where you are in the world, no matter who's fighting for you. So I think, and also my sister brought up the aspect of I think Ben said something what happened or what went wrong, and then my sister brought up this idea that Cabral came up with this class suicide perspective that Cabral thought out. So I mean, it's. And also, I think what's also important is to place South Africa within the larger context of imperialism and colonialism in Africa, because there is no post in Africa. There's only neo, or it never changed. So once we place that within a particular context, and we place it in that larger context, then what ends up happening is that we approach it different. But if we approach it as if it was something that happened and now it's not, then our range of thought and behaviors towards it is going to be limited as well. So what happens is that once we say that it never stopped in the first place, then we've got to continue with the struggle to fight it and move in a direction of pushing it to a direction for the masses. So I think that becomes very, very important, because anytime we talk about South Africa, and when you talk about North Africa, we're always trying to fragment Africa within the context, and also not within the context of the way the imperialists fragmented And Colonial said divided Africa. But when we look at apartheid, we look at Jim Crow South, and then also that goes back to the idea, the idea of new Jim Crow. It was, to me, there's no new Jim Crow. Because what ends up happening is a continuation of slavery that was happening in the first place, but just the means are a little bit different. And if we think of something as being new within the context of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, then how we approach it is going to be, again, it's going to be limited, because we have to approach it from the perspective that we need to get rid of it because it's not working. So in that particular context, again, I go back to how I opened up this statement, is that the measure of progress is always the condition of the masses.
Just one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just one. I mean, it's not really something big revelation, but just connecting to Yedida. Okay, Yedida. And Kwame Nkrumah's neocolonialism, and also the connection that you mentioned to South Africa and the United States. I think this whole illusion that we're over something that is post-apartheid, and now that the function of enabling more imperialism by a black president being in power is really something that very much reminds me of what Kwame Nkrumah said, as in neocolonialism is something that indices its victims with sweet music. So there's a lot of sweet music while the oppression is still going on. And there's a lot of illusion. So I think, how to show solidarity is basically to stay awake and not to believe the hype, because that's very depowering for the people that's going on, and because that's the most brutal level of oppression and perfect, if the oppression is celebrated and wrapped up as something that is supposed to be freedom. And I think that works very much in the present day, this whole sweet music thing. So I think that's something that's a challenge concerning South Africa, but also different contexts, all contexts actually.
Go to the next question, but I just
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I like what both of them said in terms of when we stop and we fragment time blocks. Like, okay, first we got Mandela's free, and now South Africa's free, and then everything is done. Then we don't have racism, we don't have these boundaries. We got a civil rights bill passed, and now we are able to sit next to white folks on a bus, and we're good until something else happens. And it's this whole process of African development worldwide is limited to only certain times, and it's not. It's all one continuous thing. And we have a way of kind of romanticizing our experience in certain times and leaving it there. And the things that you have to continue to struggle, we're not free. We're just not free. And I know people may think that just because you get to walk in a certain neighborhood and hold hands and date a certain type of people, and we ain't free. And as soon as we realize that, then I think that we get to move past it. We're not free. Africa ain't free, and we ain't got our resources. If millions of Africans can die and no one bats an eye, that's a problem. If we don't bat an eye, that's a problem. And I think that goes more back to our internationalist perspective, where if we have millions of people dying in the Congo on a yearly basis, and we got millions of people who can die in Sierra Leone, and millions of Africans that die in Rwanda, and we just so used to Black death, and we just have, it's an issue that are not accountable to any kind of overall political agenda of the continent. And so you're always going to have a place where you're always going to have a situation where Africa is not going to be, it's not going to work for itself, it's going to work for an outside entity.
Yeah, this question is a very, very complex question, and I think it's complex simply because we have a class of Africans who are actually supporting the exploitation of their own people, which is pretty much the same thing that happens here within the context of the United States. So when we're thinking about this idea of a new form, we have to, the reason why, again, it becomes complex is because the idea, like Alhaji said, is that at first, if the U.S. or other nations were scared of it, then it must be good. I mean, you get that first impression, but then when you really look back, and this when it becomes our responsibility to think critically and to look critically at certain at these particular things within the context, because any direct or indirect system of domination for the express purposes of control and exploitation of a people or of a resources, no matter if a person is brown, no matter if a person is polka dot, red, green, or whatever, it becomes a problem. So I think within that context, we're looking at this as this, again, we're fragmenting these particular thought processes. That's the reason why we have some people on the stage that are doing their dissertations and things that need to link this history. To link this history, to show this history, to show how this idea of history is actually happening right now in our faces, but what are we doing about it? And this is when critical consciousness becomes important. Not only are we aware of this, what are we doing within the context of organizing and doing something about it on a mass level? Now, again, when we get back to the Council of African Affairs, we look at this history, is that, I mean, there was meetings that, actually I did some work with the Council of African Affairs. There were meetings that they would put out a bulletin on a Monday, and for a meeting in the middle of the day, for a meeting at 7 o'clock that night, and 1,000 people would show up. We look at the things that people do within the context of organizing today. You might get 50, and that's what you're doing good if you get 50. You leave, you like, I won tonight, it's like, man, I got 50 people out. But I think it becomes important because there's something else that I think, and I was going through some archives of Dr. King's speeches, and one of the things, Dr. King, the people that don't like it, Dr. King, the people don't like, in Dr. King. And one of the things that he was trying to develop, and one of the things he was talking about, this idea of a creative maladjustment. To be maladjusted to racism, to be maladjusted to imperialism, to be maladjusted. And so when we look at how we're not within the context of nobody's even batting an eye to China, but we're like, well, what's going on? And then at the same time, they're extracting all these resources and reinscribing these systems of oppression and these systems of domination. What's happening is nobody's maladjusted from it. There's nobody's maladjusted for the Dunn case that just came out not too long ago. So then the connectivities and the continuities are important, and we must understand the contradictions and trace those patterns.
Okay. All right, so that kind of ends sort of that section of the program. Now we're going to move on to now is more of a question and answer comment section from the audience. So I'm going to pass around a microphone as far as I can go with this thing.
Wait, I'm gonna lift it all.
Make your foot something. Okay. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll try to get to you in some type of order. There's one right here.
Hello, my name is Gaz Anyadegwu. I'm in grad school in economics at Howard University, and also I want to know, like, how can we decolonize the minds of Africans? Like, honestly, 90% of us are slaves mentally, globally. Like, I notice how, like, our minds are just messed up. The way we think, the way we act, the way we hate each other, the way we, like, want to be, our aspirations as in progress, our values, what we want to do in life. Pretty much everything benefits the West that we want to do. Like, not everyone, but like a lot of us, like, our minds are just messed up. I notice how many Africans will, like, wear European flag clothing. Like, would you ever see someone who's Jewish wear swastika clothing, or an Arab wear an Israel flag clothing, or an Armenian wear a Turkish and Ottoman clothing? Like, why do we have to fight for our oppressors who continue to oppress us for hundreds of years? Why would we celebrate their religions? Why would we celebrate their holidays, So how can we do that?
So I think that that's a question that I hear all the time, and I think that people think that we're going to get all the African people in the world into a room, and somehow we're going to have some political education session that's going to erase all of hundreds of years of colonization and enslavement from the minds of African people. I mean, I think the thing that what people have to do is just make struggle. I mean, I think one of the things, just in my development as an African woman, like it takes a lot to even declare myself as being born in the United States as an African woman, because somehow that's not something that I should call myself. And I think that you have to struggle for your own identity. You have to struggle against oppression, and you have to, in my opinion, people who feel aligned with a particular idea, they need to join organization and make that struggle real. People need to see that. And I think, you know, just through that process, a lot of people's mindset change. And the larger that you build, and you have to build a movement, and you have to, and the larger that movement, the more minds you're going to change. The people who just sitting on the couch who have a particular way of thinking, it's going to change. But nothing's going to change if we're just sitting here in these little, in these meetings and just talking amongst ourselves. That we have to be out there in the street raising criticism. We have to be out there struggling. We have to show other people, you know, what it is that we talking about. What it is about liberation, and that's, you know, it's a big question, but I think that that's one of the ways we can start. Make struggle. Make sure that struggle is known.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that question is a super big question. I mean, I teach an intro to African American Studies class at ECU as part of what I do. And I mean, that's the #1 question that people want to write papers on, people want to deal with. But like my sister said here, I mean, it's we have to understand also that it is a protracted struggle. There's not going to be immediate gains in that particular thing. There's been a lot that's been done. A lot of times, again, but because a lot of what has been done has been put in the footnotes of history. We have to do our due diligence to read those footnotes along with the rest of the book. So I think that becomes important to understand. But yeah, I mean, it's an internal struggle and an external struggle. To find identity, to move in a direction, and most of the only way you can do that is by joining organizations. That's pretty much all we can do at this particular point. Continue on. And also understand that the fruits of that struggle are going to come. It may not come in this generation, but we live our life in a way that we might see it in the next generation.
We should struggle for it this generation.
And I think one of the things I could say is that, you know, we're all products of the society that we're brought into, right? So we have to be understanding of the reasons why that happens, right? We have to re-educate ourselves so that we can also spread the word and you know, try and help educate other people and build with other people. Again, that's one of the reasons why I became a historian myself, is because I want to educate myself on what we've been doing in our struggles, our lessons that we can learn, and then hopefully share those lessons with my students and maybe plant some seeds. But I also agree that you have to join organizations, build organizations, and you know, try and do it as a collective process. I mean, there's an individual aspect to it, but then it's also a collective process that we have to do.
Yeah, I can only add, I mean, it's a huge question. I think it's a question for all of us, and I just want to like pick up on what everyone said. It's something that's a continuing process. And since colonization is so radical, decolonization is a very radical process. As Fanou also reminds us of, we've been dehumanized to such a radical extent that it is something that like embraces all levels of us. So I think just coming back to the level of Black internationalism, I think this is a very important aspect for our decolonization, to have a global understanding of our oppression and organizing ourselves on that, like with that critical consciousness of a global oppression. Because dividing us is essential. It's essential for imperialism to divide us and to have a fragmented, only issue-related understanding of it. For example, I don't know, being Austrian, just be happy to be accepted as Black Austrian, and then, you know, peace in the world. So I think to see those connections is very important, but I cannot answer that. I mean, I think if we would have an answer, we wouldn't be sitting here, we'd just be free. So yeah, but it's a very important question that you raise, and I do understand that it can be very frustrating. But like James already mentioned, there's also the way in which we erase our resistance as well. So I think we should also reconnect to the memory of resistance that we have. And there's so many ways in which we erase ourselves based on class, based on gender. So who do we see and who do we remember in our resistances? And I think that's very important for our present day and our present day consciousness as well.
Okay, so next person, we're gonna go here and then in the back.
Hello everyone, my name is Chelsea. Sorry if this comes out kind of confusing, I'm just nervous. I'm going back to what you all were saying about the past history and, you know, the treatment and how we kind of have become dehumanized in this sort of way. What effect do you feel all this has had on the mental health state of all of us as a people of Africans and of people of African descent here in the United States? And do you feel that mentally we have limited ourselves, or all of this has prevented us from moving forward from a mental health perspective?
I think that we've been colonized, enslaved for like hundreds of years, and that in and of itself is a whole process of being you're mentally disturbed after that. Like after you've seen your family's taken away, you just get slaughtered by, you know, masses, and you see that there's a whole type of education, there's a whole type of miseducation that happens in that process, and people, you know, we inherit, and it's a generational thing where your mental health, you know, people. I remember the chairman said something about his mother used to beat him and his brothers, and he said, I'm gonna beat it out of you before the white man does. You know, it's a generational thing, because we're trying to protect. In some cases, we're trying to be safe. We're trying to respond to white people. So then when we get wins like civil rights, so when we, which is, you know, ridiculous notion, because we're humans, we're supposed to be, you know, born with that. And when we get wins from the civil rights, and you can, you don't have to now go to the color fountain, or you get to, you know, go to the same city with the white people without having to present a pass, and all these other types of things, that people, you know, accept that. And you know, it may not be something where you think somebody is like crazy or dysfunctional for accepting, but it becomes, it has limited us. It's limited what we think our freedom should be. It's limited us to just equating ourselves to white people. It limits us to not think beyond that. You know, what is, and if we can't look beyond just having the same things as people who have oppressed us, then I think overall we're all mentally dysfunctional. So,
yeah, I wanted to add to that too, is that there's also a biological aspect to that as well, because the stresses and some of the diseases that we even suffer today are born out of this particular state of stress. Interestingly enough, I just saw a report that was released. I was rushing over here, and I saw a report that actually is a study that's looking at how poverty actually biologically or physiologically affects people. And of course, within that particular aspect, we're talking about people who are disproportionately affected by poverty, which is people of African descent, and also, you know, of course, poor people as well. So I think that becomes important to understand how that link, how the mind also has an impact on the body as well. And we're suffering from things medically that generally we're not there in some of the documents and some of the history that I've read that wasn't there before these particular things were aggressively placed on people of African and people of African descent. So I think that becomes important as well. How do we make those link? I'm not sure if you're in grad school or anything like that, but it might be a study that you might want to do. I said it might be a study that you might want to do.
I'm studying psychology now,
great.
So I'm trying to see
there we go.
where I want to go.
add one more thing to that, because you touched on it, and I think in terms of poverty and mental health, people try to understand why are these black boys killing each other in the streets, you know? Why is it that they, you know, we got the black on black crime, and of course when we say, you know, there's outside elements that contribute to that, but there's a mental thing that happens in the minds of our youth when they feel like it's okay to kill one another, and then nothing happens to them, because they understand that Black death is okay, you know. And so that also, I mean, there's a lot of things that play into the mental, you know, capacity of African people underneath oppression, underneath colonialism, underneath enslavement, and it hasn't gone away, hasn't dropped off because, you know, we were so-called free. It just continues and manifests itself in different ways.
Yeah, I was just, I mean, because you also mentioned that you studied psychology. I was just thinking of psychologist, Afrocentric psychologist who is based in Germany. Her name is Grade Kilomba. And she, I just remember her work is called Plantation Memories, I think. I'm not 100% sure. And she talks about racism as trauma, black people facing racism as trauma. And I think it's connected to what we discussed earlier, that it's a continuous oppression. That, I mean, there is no post to the oppression, there's no post-imperialism, it's still continuing. And that adds to the reality of trauma. And also what was just at this hearing that I was talking about on so-called Afro Phobia, Philomena Essed, who was based in the Netherlands and is she researches on everyday racism, specifically on like as black women are experiencing it in the Netherlands. And she talked about the fact that, I don't know how it is in the United States, but in Europe, there is a very high percentage of black people being diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the question is how this happens. Is it a pathologization? Is too much. Pathologization, like, you know, the process of, yeah, thank you. So, you know, you get the gist. So that's the question. And it's also a reality that suicide is a reality in our movement. And one of our very prominent black German sheroes, Maya Yim, actually decided to end her life. She committed suicide. And it's also something that we have not found words to address sufficiently as well. So I would say yes, but at the same time, there's a great need for work. So if it's something, I think this is something that has not been addressed enough in a context that does not individualize those realities. I don't know if that's, so if it's something, I think your work would be needed. I don't know if that's something you're working on, but in case you are, it's definitely something that is still missing to address those realities, and maybe even address them from a global perspective, because there is, I know that's a lot, but there is a lot of connections as well, you know, between the conditions of mental health of people of African descent from a global perspective.
Okay, and can I just suggest a couple of things to read? Like, if you've heard of Frantz Fanon, psychiatrist, or another person is Amos Wilson. He was a psychologist. He kind of dealt with the psychology of oppression.
Good afternoon. My name is Asantor Nkrumah Toure. My question for the panelists, in terms of a Pan-Africanist consciousness, what are you all opinions about what's going on now currently in Venezuela, and also the recent protests by African immigrants in Israel, and they were protesting against the racism there in Israel? Thank you.
Whoever wants to.
So Venezuela, here we have, first of all, I have family in Venezuela, and I have a cousin who's like 20-something years old. He hates the Chavez stuff. He hates the Republic of Venezuela. He hates it. He wants it to be like America. And around 2002, when they tried to overthrow Chavez's regime, he was maybe like a baby and wouldn't even understand what it was like prior to that. And so what we have now is a struggle between petty bourgeois forces and who are trying to co-opt, who may be trying to co-opt, and I say maybe because there's real grievances. If you have a crime rate that is really high and you have an inflation, those are real grievances. And so what they're using, these forces who, this man was, Leopoldo Lopez, who is he was Harvard educated, got most of his education here, and we already know there's a colonial school system here, that have you believing that your oppressor is your friend and your friend is your enemy. And so, so they've co-opted this movement, and they have made it clear that they don't want socialist government. And so, we have people who are confused on that, because then we have this pro-government protest. Lots of people out in the streets as well is trying to show their support for the government that's Maduro's government. But the thing is that it's not about leadership, it's about the people. It's a people's revolution. You know, it's the masses of people who when they tried to take Chavez away, they actually went and got him back. You know, they had him on, it was the people. It wasn't Chavez that ordered himself to be relieved. It's the people who struggled and fought for the democracy that you see now, the socialism that you see now in Venezuela. And there was and when Chavez came into power, there was a lot of things that changed with these petty bourgeois forces who couldn't do the same thing that they wanted to do anymore, make agreements with people that they wanted to make agreements with. And so those are the people now that we see resurfacing and trying to make this struggle so that they can overthrow this government in Venezuela.
No, she did a great job. And there's also the part of the Africans in Israel too, she mentioned. If you want to.
Well, one of the things that concerns me is the fact that the Venezuela government, specifically under Chavez, but also now, has been open to the concerns of African people throughout the globe. I know, in particular, a group that I was a part of, Students Against Mass Incarceration, we were able to actually go to the Venezuela embassy and present to them about political prisoners in the United States. And they had an open ear to it. They were willing to listen to it when we did that presentation. So again, that's a link that we could possibly build as far as having an internationalist perspective. And I'm pretty sure that if they replace the government, that's not going to be the same thing. So again, that's something that we need to keep in mind. You know, that's a link that we could build if they're able to maintain that. As far as Israel goes, I'm not too informed about it, but it's very clear. I mean, Israel is a settler colony like the United States. So it doesn't surprise me that they would imprison their Africans and try and deport all the African people who have been moving there in a very similar fashion, if not worse than what's going on in Europe. So it doesn't surprise me. Other than that, I'm not quite sure what else I could say about that, other than that we need to highlight that and get that out there. Because I've seen some of the videos and they're very, very aggressive about it. They'll have rallies in the streets where they're saying all kinds of racial slurs to these African immigrants. And I think I heard actually that they're keeping them sometimes in desert prisons, yes, where their lives are at risk. And these are people who came to Israel hoping for a quote unquote a better life, or whatever the case may be, and now they're in these prisons in the middle of the desert in a lot of cases.
So, I'm sorry I missed that question, but Israel, like he said, is a settlement colony, settler colony, and it was established as an outpost of imperialism in the Middle East to keep track, so that when something was to pop off, you have these capitalist imperialists that can go into Israel and kind of, keep the peace, so to speak. And so, it's no surprise that they would have this position toward Africans who are coming into their country. They have that, they went and deposed or moved out the people who were actually there in the first place. So, it's not a surprise that if immigrants coming in from Africa or any place else in the world is coming into the state, it's no surprise at all that they would have this aggressive behavior toward them.
And also wanted to add, I'm not going to say anything spectacular because they already stole my thunder. But what I will say is that there's a historical piece as far as people of African descent here in the United States also dealing with this question of Israel and its racism as well. So there's already history there. And one of the things, again, just fragmented things that we're doing in the fragmented process and fragmented thinking is that we have to connect those particular things, because the question of Palestine, the people that stood up here in the United States are people of African descent, Africans. So I think that becomes important of how do we reinvigorate that and deal with that particular question in a solidarity, because again, I think it becomes important to look at it within a holistic frame of reference as opposed to that fragmented frame of reference. So the only thing I add to what they said is that there's already a history of involvement, and until we understand what was done and how that history was working, we can apply that to today.
All right, next question. Anyone have any other comments, questions?
You got to walk up as far as it goes.
Hi, my name is Lisa Bono. I actually did international relations as well, and I follow international events like crazy. But I was just curious, what do you guys think about the violence and racism towards the African migrants and Black Libyans, during the whole entire 2011 war in Libya, where they not only had to deal with NATO bombing, but they also had to deal with just like unbelievable like levels of racism and violence from their own countrymen and from other Libyans who, when the media started reporting that Gaddafi was bringing in African mercenaries left and right, that a lot of the Libyan rebels just started attacking Africans, both the migrants and both the black Libyans, and even like, just said really derogatory and racist things against, black Libyans and the migrants as well. Thank you.
I guess since I have the mic in my hand. We covered, my colleague and I on Africa Now, we covered this particular issue extensively, specifically on Africa Now. My colleague Moiza, who's sitting in the audience, we really dealt with this particular issue. And as far as the reports that we understand, and Moiza probably can help me out. Yes, I'm calling you out to help me out on this. If I understand it, this was just basically a tactic that individuals were bringing in. It wasn't Gaddafi, if I understand it, that was bringing these individuals in. It was also these so-called, this ambiguous rebel factions that were doing this. So this was just another aspect of how do you break down. So they wanted to make sure when they went in covering their bases, so to speak. So they wanted to make sure not only we're coming in over the top, but we're coming in underneath as well, by putting in individuals who actually look like you to make sure we're going to get you, because we're going to get you regardless. And this is another tactic that also, this is when history becomes important. I just did a talk on the Congo on Thursday. I've been in a series of talks. Like, I've been talking since Thursday. I'm like almost talked out at this particular point. But one of the things that we look back at the Congo, what was happening at the Congo when Lumumba was killed, Lumumba was deposed by actually one of his own generals, and you had a lot of the individuals who were in, a lot of Congolese who were there, were fighting against Congolese. But there was also, of course, backed by the Belgians. The Belgians are actually pulling the strings behind all this stuff and using these particular using people with black faces to actually do this. So I think that this is the exact same situation. And again, we dealt with this extensively, and that's the way I understood it to have happened, and now that it's a historical context. But also, what I think was important is that we need to revisit and what is going on right now in Libya, which we don't really know. It happened. We covered it, but now what's going on, which is another thing that we have to do when we're dealing with these particular issues, when we're talking about Africa, but also when we're talking about the African, again, the international community. Because what's going to happen, what everybody's going to do after the done verdict dies down? What is everybody going to do after all of these other things die down? Which is something that I think Kwame Ture said, is that we'll get mad for a minute and then sit back down. I think that becomes very important to understand. I don't know.
Next, anyways, there's another question or comment? Make sure.
Hey, well, me and my friend both go to grad school right now. He goes economics at Howard University. I go to political science at Columbia University in New York. And we're both wondering, like, how can we as students contribute to, like, I'm Latino, he's African American. How can we contribute to the struggle, and like, even though we're going to these Eurocentric institutions that kind of emphasize like kind of the system and how to like maintain power in the system, and we basically make the rich people richer through the jobs that we could possibly get. So what I'm wondering is like, how could we as like minorities kind of contribute to like, making sure that the society kind of views the world in a different way and like kind of changes for the future.
I think that trying to do that as individuals is going to be really hard. No individual ever changed anything or started anything. It's about coming together and, can you hear me?
You're a little loud.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said it's about, I think that trying to do that as individuals is going to be very difficult. We have to learn that we have to join organization. No individual ever started anything. Any leader that any revolutionary leader, progressive revolutionary leader was made a leader by the people, by the masses of people behind them. And so if we want to start changing the concepts and the ways people think about certain things, then we have to join organization and have membership and use those spaces to make those types of discussions happen. And if it's possible, bring that to the streets. I think that it's really important that we actually just move past spaces like this where we kind of like talk to ourselves a lot, and we have to figure out how we can inform the masses. And if that's, and that can be done through word of mouth, that can be done through media, that can be done through a lot of ways, but we need to make sure that happens. But I think the main point is you gotta build organization in order to make a lot of the things that, we wanna, in terms of changing perspectives, happen.
And I would say, as students, obviously I would say start on campus and if you don't have organizations already on your campus that deal with these type of issues that you're interested in or that you feel need to be highlighted more, you can create one. But then also, as she was saying, you definitely want to take it to the masses. You don't want to just stay on the campus alone. You want to start a student organization or join one that attempts to try and take it, and build with community organizations that might already be working with those type of issues. Or if not, maybe inspire people or work with other people. You see what I'm saying? So I think as students, you are in, as you're saying, a privileged situation. So the best thing I think you could do at this time is take advantage of that privilege and try and use it. For example, maybe have forums on campus where you invite everybody from the local community to come to Columbia. They might have never been to Columbia, so you can build that bridge with the community, right? As opposed to staying separate from the community at Columbia or at Howard.
Add one more thing, or just as opposed to inviting the community to the college, going into the community itself, making connections with community members, getting a community center, and finding out what's important to them. If it ties into what you already have a passion about, then I think that the connection can be made there.
I just wanted to add that the university is also a specific place, and it had played a very, and still plays a very important role in the process of colonization. So the whole aspect of miseducation, the whole aspect of alienation of not only African intellectuals, but from the people, from the masses, is something that is still an ongoing reality. So to be aware of that is also a way that ties back to the question of decolonizing our minds, to be aware of that reality that universities have different levels of being colonized. You can choose which level you want to go to, but it's still never, we don't have a freedom university yet. That's still to be created. But so I think there is no university, you mentioned that specific, but we can exchange that and just talk about the different levels. So I think to be aware of that level of miseducation, and I think that's also an important aspect.
I wanted to provide a complementary perspective, because as a professor, I get students that come to me all the time. What can I do? What can I do? Certain things. And the first thing that I tell them, obviously, is organize and join organizations, start organizations. But one of the things that I think is important is to stay agitated, to stay concerned, to not allow the process, because by you understanding the processes of colonization, and the academy played a very important part historically in the 1870s. We don't want to get into that, but that's a whole nother panel, right? But what ends up happening is I think that becomes important. But also another thing that I struggle with getting my students to do is to read widely. So what that means is that while you're staying agitated, and while you're trying to join organizations, again, I'm very, very big on, I think Cabral is very, very instructive in this, is that you have to have a theory, you have to have something to point you in a way. So that means that you have to be able to know what you're talking about, right? So if I'm your professor and I'm sitting up there telling you certain things, you don't have to digest that, because you've read widely. And so then you can show, be careful in doing this, because you got to get a grade, right? But you can show the contradictions in what's going on. If you was in my class, I love that. Actually, we have debates in class. I want to be challenged, because number one, you guys, everybody's communication age, right? So people are Googling stuff when I say it, and they're, oh no, Professor Pope, this was wrong. So what? I got a date wrong. I don't have to remember dates. You know what I mean? But I think the number one thing is to give you another perspective, is to stay agitated. to make sure that you stay concerned, you stay bothered by these things that you see, but at the same token, you institutionalize these things, and institutionalize this agitatedness, and read widely. Read widely. Don't just read what the professors give you, because a lot of professors have ideological purposes, right? You know, many of them, but not all professors. I don't have no ideology. Psych, I do. But my point is to think critically. Think critically, but stay agitated. I think that becomes important.
Yeah, I just have a quick sort of comment to reinforce what the panelists said about organization. Two pieces. One, I think it's important to join organizations, but I also think it's important to join permanent organizations which have the ideological base. The brother talked about a theory. You can't change your analysis unless you're studying collectively on a regular basis. So I'm a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. My name is Mjiba, and we have work study process. That's not like a APRP plug, but it's just saying that organizations that you join, it's not enough just to join an organization and think that that's going to change your mind. You have to be able to be engaged in a constant political education process. And then I just want to make one more quick point and a quick announcement. The second quick point is that oftentimes we come to these events and we talk about, we're talking to ourselves and sort of what can we do. And I think that sometimes we get confused and believe that we are the Messiah that's going to sort of liberate African people, right? And so I think that we have to keep in mind that, like, what is our contribution to Pan-Africanism? What is our contribution to the liberation of African people and humanity? And be able to make that contribution and be happy with that contribution, because the reality is there are those that came before us and there are those who will come after us. And it's our job to do what we were put on this earth to do in regards to the liberation, because we know that there are no messiahs. So there's that second point. And the quick announcement, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, we're having a raffle, $2, $100 gift certificate to this very place, Sankofa's #1 prize for our programs. We'll be in the back. Thanks.
Okay, anyone have the next question, comment?
Last question. I wanted to ask, how do you guys feel about religion? Is it positive or negative for global Africans around the world? And also wanted to know, like, how does religion play a role in revolution? Like, you know how in Egypt they use like Islam to kind of unite and overthrow the government to some extent, but why don't they do that in countries where there's neo-colonial happening right now, in Africa or the Caribbean Islands?
That's a whole other panel. Yeah, that's a whole other panel on that particular question. Yeah. I don't even know where to begin on that. I mean, because it's a complex question. You're talking about a cultural artifact, which is religion, and that can change at any given time because the state power, whatever religion it is, that can be changed. But and also we know within the context of here in the United States, the history of religion that it played in the reinforcement or the reinscription of domination as well, because we have on one side the use of religion to justify the dehumanization of a people. But at the same token, you have the use of religion to free people, because you get John Brown who said, God told me to go kill all of the slave masters. So I think that question is a very, very interesting question, but I think it also goes in the context of how as opposed to asking a question of religion, I would take the question to how does culture play a role in revolutions. And now you're having a great conversation that we can again, I'm a Cabral, you can deal with Cabral and other individuals, that you have a better platform to be able to understand that.
Okay, so religion is should not be the central point of any revolutionary struggle, because you're going to have some problems. Because there are people within my organization who are from different religious backgrounds, but we unite around the theory. The theory of African internationalism is what unites people to make revolution. I don't think that if you use any particular people, they may in their own mind say, okay, I'm an African internationalist, and then I'm a Christian, and Jesus, was revolutionary, and I'm going to go. They can do that in their whole mind, but I think in terms of making the revolution, it can't be one that's based on religion. So we just got to find a theory, a revolutionary theory to build off of.
Let me add to that too. You actually just made me think about. I don't know why I didn't say this because again, Malcolm X is instructive in this organization of Afro-American unity, because one of the things that he said is we're accepting the theory of liberation within that particular aspect. And so you can be. He was like, we accept whether you're Muslim, Christian, or whatever. If you're for the benefit or for the liberation of people of African descent or the African world, then you can come join this organization. So I think that, again, I think that becomes important. Again, there's history here. It's our responsibility to kind of read that, but also not read it as being just something that happened in the past, but how can it be something that can help today? Because of course we have this so-called diversified world, as if that's something that's like popped up. The world's always been diversified, right? But I mean, this idea, I think it becomes important to understand, what exactly are we doing? Are we using religion as the centerpiece, or is the theory of liberation, or freedom, or change, is the centerpiece?
Okay. All right. This is going to be the final comment question.
Yeah, I think the young brother here asked a very good question. The struggle of God's people, and I'm saying that as a Christian, is paramount, kind of what the sister here just said. So even though I'm a Christian, I don't identify with Christians like those who want to bash gays and lesbians or want to talk about the Tea Party and things like that. I'm about all of God's people. And I think we need to really look at the history of African people who were atheists and were also in revolutionary struggle. And the one I can't think of there's a list of people who are like that, you can Google it. But the person that comes to my mind is, I think, Butterfly McQueen, the artist, some of her quotes and her writings, and also James Baldwin. Even though he grew up in the church, in his life and in his writings and his work, he began to really question and interrogate the church and its contradictions, all of them. And he also began to question and distance himself from the church as an institution. So we should not let religion or the lack thereof keep us from making our contribution to make the world better for everybody, because even God loves atheists.
Thank you. All right. So lastly, okay, so it's going to be the final, that was the final comment or question, and we're just going to kind of close out here with closing statements from each one of our panelists, kind of to summarize what they think and their thoughts. And we'll start here, because you went last. You got to go first this time.
I'm warmed up, right? I really don't have any concluding comments, because I don't like to conclude. I think we need to understand it as continuity, as a continuance. And I would just say that let's continue this discussion and continue this dialogue, and not let this be, I don't like to say goodbye a lot of times. To me, saying goodbye or concluding is like that's it. But again, we're dealing with these issues that are continuous. So I don't really have anything profound to say, but other than just to stay agitated, stay upset at these particular issues that are going on.
So I think one of my biggest things, and I think what I sometimes get frustrated by, is I want people to join organization. I think that they can't make, the things that we are discussing today are not going to go away tomorrow. And if we leave out of here and not be able to get together and build for the future that we want, we are not going to see it. And so, as always, Assistant Executive APRP, okay, I'm going to do my plug too for the African People's Socialist Party and African Internationalism, and take a look at that, and our chairman, Omali Ashitela, who's actually in town at the University of Maryland right now. But just build organization, join organization, align yourself with people who want to see the struggle, want to see African people win, and want to struggle for that in our lifetime. I think that we can do what we can in this lifetime, but we need to struggle for it, and just join organization.
And I'd just like to reiterate those 3 points that I brought up in the beginning. I think we need to continue educating ourselves and others. Again, also, it's always best if you do it in an organization and if there's a theory behind it, number one. Number two, we have to be aware of U.S. foreign policy, and we have to be very critical of it, because we live in the belly of the empire, so we have to be critical of it. That's our role as African people in the belly of the beast, right? So we have to continue to study U.S. foreign policy and try and influence it as much as possible to the benefit of African people. And then thirdly, try and build networks of international solidarity around issues which are similar And again, I don't want it to be just issue based, because I know Arun brought that up. People focus just on the issues, but again, I think that could be a starting point. Whether it's something like, again, stop and frisk and the SB 1070 and building with Chicano and indigenous people, or whatever issue or whatever problems you see, trying to build those international networks of solidarity.
Yeah, it's really hard to conclude, but I just, and it's probably going to be a repetition, but I wanted to add to the question of Black internationalism. Having a global understanding of oppression being so central for our liberation, we also have to move beyond a solidarity among Black people and also to a solidarity amongst all oppressed and colonialized people. And I brought a lot of books, and I didn't have time to really bring them in, but there's one thing that I can bring in now, and that's a book by Vijay Prashad. It's a people's history of the darker nation, and it talks about the third world as a political vision of Asian, African, and Latin American people uniting themselves. And I think if it comes to theory as a weapon, I think we need to sharpen that theory, have a present understanding, and not be enticed by the sweet music of colonialism, and then also organize. So I think there's a lot to do, but I think this aspect of solidarity beyond people of African descent is also essential for a global sense of liberation. Thank you.
All right, everyone, can you give our panelists a hand? And our next, as I mentioned, this is a series, the Black Left in the 21st Century series, and our next program will be, like I said, every fourth Sunday of the month on March 23rd. It'll be on the Black Left on gender and sexuality. So this is a very important topic that's very central to our movement, discussing the issue of patriarchy and homophobia within our movement, within our community, and in the larger society. We're going to have a brother named Greg Thomas, who's actually a DC native, who teaches at Tufts University, has a book called The Sexual Demons of Colonial Power, very good book analysis on gender, sexuality. A brother who's a Black feminist named Uwari Osayande, who's a poet out of Philly. A sister named Miron Selassie, she is a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, and someone else who changed recently, so I can't think of them at the moment. But we're going to have, it's going to be a very good panel discussion around a particular topic that I think we kind of ignore or don't talk enough about. So we're going to have that here, and that's going to be March 23rd, 4 p.m. the same time. And at that, we can close out, and really want to thank you. And one other thing in the back, I know that there's always a how did you all hear about this? How many of you heard about it through the email? Raise your hand. Because they have an email list in the back. If you're not on it, in the very back of at the table, the desk where the cashier is, you can actually sign an email and get lists. They send out an email at least once a week about various events or books they have and things like that. And as well, please support the store. We had a series of books that kind of connected to this. So support the store, support the cafe, etc. So thank you all for coming out, and see you next month.